The ballroom at the Ashford estate glittered with the particular, careful opulence of a wedding designed to impress. Crystal chandeliers threw soft golden light across 300 guests in evening wear. A string quartet played somewhere near the terrace doors, and the air carried the mingled scent of white roses and champagne. Victoria Reynolds moved through the crowd in a fitted ivory gown, carrying, tucked carefully in her clutch, a folded document that represented the single most meaningful gift she had ever given anyone. She found her husband, Andrew Collins, near the bar, deep in conversation with several of his father's business associates, and she waited for a natural pause before approaching, the document in her clutch feeling almost warm against her side, as if it carried its own quiet significance. She had spent months arranging this gift in complete secrecy, coordinating with her attorney and financial advisor through a careful, deliberate process designed to ensure the surprise would land exactly as she'd envisioned it. A gesture of genuine generosity toward the woman who had, despite years of complicated family dynamics, always shown Victoria at least a measure of quiet kindness. She had no idea, standing there in that glittering ballroom, that within the hour, her husband would humiliate her in front of every single person in that room, and that his cruelty would ultimately cost his family more than any of them could have possibly imagined. To understand exactly how Victoria Reynolds ended up standing in a ballroom holding an $8.8 million secret her husband didn't even know existed, you have to go back to the very beginning of her relationship with Andrew Collins, and further still, to the family she'd grown up in that had shaped, in quiet but decisive ways, the values she would eventually bring into her marriage. Victoria had grown up in a household that was, by most conventional measures, wealthy. Her parents had built a successful regional manufacturing business over several decades, providing Victoria with a comfortable, privileged childhood. But her parents had raised her with a particular, deliberate emphasis on humility, on understanding that wealth carried responsibility rather than entitlement, on treating people with genuine respect, regardless of their financial circumstances. Victoria had absorbed these values thoroughly, carrying them into her own adult life and eventually into the business she built independently after college, a technology consulting firm that had grown, over roughly a decade, into a genuinely successful enterprise generating substantial revenue entirely through her own effort and strategic vision. She met Andrew Collins at a charity gala when she was 29, drawn initially to his polished charm, his easy conversation, the confident, assured way he moved through a room clearly designed for people exactly like him. Andrew came from considerable old money, the Collins family having built and maintained their fortune across several generations. Their name carrying a certain social weight within the circles Victoria found herself increasingly moving through as her own business grew. Their courtship had felt, at the time, like a genuine meeting of equals. Two successful, driven people building something together. Andrew had been attentive during those early months, complimentary, seemingly genuinely interested in Victoria's own achievements and ambitions, rather than simply her financial standing. It was only gradually, over the years that followed their marriage, that Victoria began to notice a shift in the underlying dynamic between them, a shift so incremental that she found herself, for a long time, unable to fully articulate exactly what had changed. Andrew had grown, steadily, more controlling in ways that were initially subtle enough to explain away. Comments about which events Victoria should attend, suggestions about how she should present herself in social settings that included his family's wealthy circle, an increasing preoccupation with how their marriage appeared to the outside world rather than how it actually felt from within it. He grew image-obsessed in a way that Victoria found increasingly exhausting, constantly calculating the social optics of every decision, every outfit, every public appearance, treating their marriage less like a genuine partnership and more like a carefully managed public performance. The disrespect, when it began to surface in public settings, arrived first in small, deniable ways. A dismissive comment here, a slightly too sharp correction there, always delivered with just enough plausible charm that Victoria found herself second-guessing whether she was overreacting rather than accurately perceiving a genuine pattern. She overlooked these warning signs for longer than she now wished she had, telling herself that every marriage required patience and understanding, that Andrew's occasional sharpness reflected stress rather than genuine contempt, that the relationship's fundamental foundation remained solid even as its surface grew increasingly strained. Margaret Collins, Andrew's mother, occupied a complicated position within this dynamic. She was, in Victoria's experience, considerably warmer than her son, capable of genuine kindness in private moments, occasionally even offering Victoria quiet, sympathetic glances during family gatherings when Andrew's behavior grew particularly sharp. But Margaret's warmth rarely translated into active intervention. She remained, throughout Victoria's marriage to her son, someone who witnessed troubling dynamics without ever quite finding the courage or inclination to address them directly. A pattern of passive complicity that Victoria had, over the years, learned to accept as simply the family's underlying culture, rather than something she could reasonably expect to change. Margaret had, for as long as Victoria had known her, harbored a particular long-standing dream connected to the Collins family's history. The family's original ancestral estate, a sprawling historic property that had been sold decades earlier during a difficult financial period, a loss that Margaret had never fully processed, often speaking wistfully about the property during family gatherings, describing childhood memories of its gardens and grand rooms with a nostalgic longing that Victoria found genuinely touching, even amid the broader complications of her relationship with the Collins family. It was this longing, observed carefully over several years, that eventually inspired Victoria's plan. Through her own business success, entirely independent of anything connected to Andrew's family wealth, Victoria had built substantial personal resources. Resources she managed carefully, strategically, with the guidance of her own attorney and financial advisor, professionals she had worked with for years and trusted implicitly, entirely separate from any advisors connected to the Collins family. When Victoria learned, through careful, discreet research, that the historic estate Margaret had spoken of so wistfully for years had recently come up for sale following the death of its most recent owner, she recognized an opportunity for a gesture of genuine, meaningful generosity, something that would demonstrate, concretely, the kind of care and respect she had always tried to extend toward Margaret, despite the broader difficulties within her marriage to Andrew. She spent months arranging the purchase in complete secrecy, working exclusively with her own trusted professionals rather than anyone connected to the Collins family, structuring the transaction as a surprise gift to be revealed during the wedding season, when the entire extended family would be gathered together for Charlotte's wedding, a moment Victoria imagined might serve as a particularly meaningful occasion for the reveal. The final purchase price, after extensive negotiation, came to $8.8 million. A substantial sum, but one Victoria's financial position allowed her to commit to comfortably, and one she considered, given the depth of Margaret's long-standing dream, entirely worth the investment. Only her attorney and financial advisor knew the full details of the purchase in the weeks leading up to Charlotte's wedding. Victoria had deliberately kept the plan secret even from Andrew, partly wanting to preserve the surprise for maximum impact, and partly, if she was honest with herself, harboring a quiet hope that revealing such profound generosity toward his mother might help repair some of the growing distance she'd sensed accumulating within her marriage over the preceding years. Charlotte Collins, Andrew's younger sister, had been engaged for just over a year to a young man from another prominent regional family, and the wedding itself had been planned as an extravagant affair befitting the Collins family's social standing. An event attended by hundreds of guests, extensively covered in the local society pages, exactly the kind of carefully managed public spectacle that Andrew, in particular, seemed to relish. The tension leading up to the wedding day itself had been building steadily, in ways Victoria recognized only in retrospect as warning signs she'd chosen, once again, not to fully confront. Andrew had grown increasingly critical in the weeks preceding the event, commenting sharply on Victoria's dress choices for various pre-wedding gatherings, correcting her publicly during a rehearsal dinner toast that Victoria had prepared with genuine care, suggesting, with an edge of contempt that had grown difficult to ignore, that her manner of speaking to certain guests reflected poorly on the family's image. Charlotte, for her part, had begun echoing some of her brother's criticisms in the days leading up to her own wedding, small comments delivered with a light, teasing tone that nonetheless carried an unmistakable undercurrent of genuine mockery. Remarks about Victoria's background, about certain mannerisms Charlotte characterized as insufficiently polished for the Collins family's social circle, comments that Victoria absorbed with the same quiet, practiced restraint she had cultivated over years of similar treatment. Margaret, throughout this mounting tension, said nothing in Victoria's defense, maintaining the same passive presence that had characterized her role within the family dynamic for years, present for every uncomfortable moment but never quite willing to intervene directly on Victoria's behalf. Victoria remained calm throughout the wedding day itself, focusing her attention on supporting Charlotte through the ceremony, on maintaining the composed, gracious presence she had learned over years of marriage into this particular family, was generally the safest way to navigate gatherings that seemed to grow more fraught with each passing year. She carried her secret gift with her throughout the day, the folded document representing the estate transfer tucked carefully in her clutch, waiting for what she imagined would be the perfect moment during the reception to reveal it. That moment, when it finally arrived, unfolded very differently than Victoria had ever imagined. The reception had progressed through its early courses smoothly enough. Toast delivered, the first dance completed, the general festive atmosphere of a lavish celebration settling comfortably over the assembled guests. Victoria had been circulating through the crowd, engaging in the kind of polite, extended conversation such events required, when she found herself standing near Andrew and a cluster of his business associates as the conversation turned unexpectedly toward her. Victoria's always been a bit particular about how she presents herself, Andrew said to the group, his tone carrying a light, dismissive quality that Victoria recognized immediately as far from complimentary despite its surface casualness. Comes from a different world than the rest of us, if you know what I mean. Sometimes it shows. One of the associates chuckled uncertainly, apparently unsure whether this was meant as genuine teasing or something sharper. Victoria felt the familiar, sinking recognition of a pattern she'd absorbed too many times before, the particular sting of being discussed as though she weren't standing directly beside the person speaking about her. "I think Victoria presents herself beautifully," she said quietly, keeping her voice light, still hoping, even in that moment, to redirect the conversation before it could escalate further. "See, that's exactly what I mean," Andrew said, turning toward her now with an expression that had hardened considerably from the easy charm he typically displayed in public settings. Something in him apparently emboldened by the wine he'd consumed throughout the evening, or perhaps simply by the accumulated tension of managing his family's elaborate social performance for the better part of the day. "You can't even take a bit of honest observation without getting defensive about it. Do you understand how embarrassing it is, constantly having to manage how you come across to people who actually matter?" The conversation around them had grown noticeably quieter, several nearby guests clearly having caught the shift in Andrew's tone, their attention drawn toward the unfolding exchange with the particular, uncomfortable curiosity that public conflict inevitably generates. "Andrew," Victoria said, her voice carrying a warning she hoped he would recognize even through his obvious intoxication. "This isn't the place for this conversation." "You're right," Andrew said, his voice rising now, carrying further across the increasingly attentive crowd around them. "It's really not the place for someone to be an embarrassment to this entire family, but here we are anyway." The word landed like a physical blow, delivered loudly enough now that Victoria understood, with a sinking, horrified clarity, that this was no longer a private exchange but had become, in the span of a single sentence, a public spectacle unfolding in front of hundreds of witnesses. The nearby conversation had died away entirely, guests turning to watch, the string quartet perhaps sensing the shift in atmosphere, allowing their current piece to trail into silence rather than immediately beginning another. "An embarrassment," Andrew continued, apparently unable or unwilling to stop himself now that he'd begun, his voice carrying the particular cutting cruelty of someone who had perhaps harbored these sentiments privately for far longer than this single evening suggested. "Do you have any idea how many times I've had to smooth things over, explain away your background, manage how you come across to people who actually matter in this family's world? I married someone I thought could handle this life, and instead I've spent years cleaning up after every socially clumsy thing you say or do." Victoria stood frozen for a long moment, the ballroom around her seeming to compress into an unbearable, suffocating silence. Hundreds of eyes fixed on her, waiting to see how she would respond to an accusation so publicly, so viciously delivered, that there was no possible way to pretend it hadn't happened. Several guests near the exchange laughed uncomfortably, the particular nervous laughter of people uncertain whether they were witnessing genuine cruelty or some strange, misguided attempt at humor. Others simply stared, visibly uncomfortable, exchanging glances that suggested a shared, unspoken recognition that whatever they were witnessing had crossed decisively beyond the bounds of acceptable wedding reception banter. Victoria felt the folded document in her clutch, the $8.8 million gift she had spent months arranging in secret, suddenly feeling less like a warm gesture of generosity and more like an almost absurd irony given the words her husband had just spoken in front of his entire extended social circle. She looked toward Margaret, standing several feet away, clearly having witnessed the entire exchange, her expression carrying visible discomfort, but, once again, no actual intervention on Victoria's behalf. Victoria said nothing further in that moment. She simply reached into her clutch, withdrew the folded document, and set it quietly on a nearby table, the gesture so understated that most of the surrounding guests, still processing the shock of Andrew's outburst, barely registered it as significant at all. She turned, without another word, to her husband and walked calmly toward the terrace doors, needing several minutes alone to process the full weight of what had just happened. Standing on the terrace, the cool evening air a welcome relief from the suffocating heat of the ballroom, Victoria found herself thinking, with unusual clarity, about years of accumulated moments very similar to this one. Smaller, more private versions of the same dynamic that had just played out on a devastatingly public stage. She thought about every social gathering where she had quietly absorbed Andrew's sharp corrections, every family dinner where she had smiled through comments designed to diminish her, every occasion where she had told herself that maintaining peace, preserving the relationship, was worth the steady, cumulative cost of her own dignity. She understood, standing there in the cool evening air, that she had spent years of her marriage trying to earn genuine acceptance from a family that had, apparently, never actually intended to extend it, regardless of how much generosity, patience, or accommodation she offered in return. The realization arrived not as sudden shock, but as a kind of quiet, devastating clarity. The recognition of a pattern she had, on some level, understood for years, but had never allowed herself to fully confront. She made her decision standing on that terrace, with a calm, deliberate resolve that surprised even herself, given the emotional intensity of the preceding minutes. She retrieved her phone and called her attorney directly, her voice steady despite everything that had just happened. "I need you to halt the estate transfer," she said, when her attorney picked up, clearly startled by the late evening call. "Immediately, before anything else proceeds. I'll explain everything tomorrow, but I need this stopped tonight." Her attorney, familiar enough with Victoria's careful, deliberate, decision-making style to trust her judgment, even without immediate explanation, confirmed that the transaction, while substantially arranged, had not yet been formally finalized, and that halting it remained entirely possible given the current stage of the process. Victoria returned to the ballroom roughly 20 minutes later, her composure fully restored, her expression carrying none of the visible distress that had driven her to the terrace in the first place. She found the wedding's master of ceremonies, a family friend who had been coordinating various announcements and toasts throughout the evening, and spoke with him quietly for several minutes. When the master of ceremonies took the microphone shortly after, announcing that Victoria Reynolds had prepared a special presentation for the family, a ripple of curious anticipation moved through the assembled guests, many of whom had witnessed the earlier confrontation and seemed uncertain what to expect from whatever Victoria might say next. Andrew, standing near the head table, visibly tensed, apparently having assumed, in the aftermath of his own outburst, that whatever conflict had occurred between them would simply be quietly absorbed and set aside, as so many similar incidents had been throughout their marriage. Victoria took the microphone with the same calm, composed presence she had carried throughout the earlier confrontation, addressing the full ballroom of guests with a steady, clear voice that carried easily across the now completely silent room. "I want to start by congratulating Charlotte and her husband on their wedding," she said. "It's a beautiful celebration, and I genuinely wish them every happiness." She paused, letting the moment settle, before continuing. "Some of you witnessed an exchange earlier this evening between myself and Andrew. I want to address that directly because I think it's relevant to what I originally planned to share with you tonight." The room had grown, if anything, even more silent, guests exchanging uncertain glances, sensing that whatever was about to unfold carried considerably more weight than a typical wedding toast. "For the past several months, I've been working in complete secrecy on a gift for Margaret," Victoria continued. "Margaret has spoken for years about the Collins family's original ancestral estate, the property her own family lost decades ago. When it recently came up for sale, I arranged, through my own resources, entirely independent of anything connected to the Collins family finances, to purchase it as a surprise gift for her. A gesture I hoped would mean something given how much she's shared with me over the years about what that property represents to her." A visible ripple of shock moved through the crowd, several guests turning to look at Margaret, who sat frozen in her seat, her expression a mixture of confusion and dawning, disbelieving hope. "The purchase price?" Victoria continued, her voice remaining steady despite the enormity of what she was about to reveal, was $8.8 million. The number landed across the ballroom with an almost physical weight, an audible gasp rippling through the assembled guests, many of whom clearly understood in that instant the sheer scale of generosity Victoria had quietly arranged, entirely without expectation of recognition or reciprocity. "I had planned to reveal this gift tonight, as a surprise for the whole family," Victoria said. "But earlier this evening, in front of many of you, my husband called me an embarrassment to this family. And I've spent the past 20 minutes thinking very carefully about what that word actually means, and about who exactly has been the embarrassment throughout the years of my marriage into this family." She looked directly at Andrew now, her voice carrying none of the emotional distress that might have colored the moment had she spoken these words in anger rather than in the calm, deliberate clarity she had arrived at on that terrace. "I called my attorney a short while ago and halted the transfer before it could be finalized," Victoria said. "The gift will not be proceeding." The silence that followed was absolute, the entire ballroom seemingly holding its breath as the full weight of what Victoria had just announced settled over the assembled guests. Margaret's expression had shifted from confusion to something closer to devastated understanding, the dream she had carried for decades apparently arriving and vanishing within the span of a single sentence. "I want to be clear about why I'm sharing this publicly, rather than simply walking away quietly," Victoria continued, addressing the room now rather than any single individual within it. "Generosity should never be something offered in the hope of finally earning acceptance from people who have already decided, regardless of what you give them, that you don't deserve genuine respect. I spent years believing that if I simply gave enough, accommodated enough, absorbed enough public and private criticism with grace, that eventually I would be treated as a genuine, valued member of this family. Tonight made it clear to me that this was never going to happen, regardless of how much I offered in return." She set the microphone down gently, the ballroom still frozen in stunned silence, and walked calmly toward the exit, leaving behind a reception that had, in the span of roughly half an hour, transformed entirely from a lavish celebration into the site of one of the most dramatic, consequential revelations most of the assembled guests had ever personally witnessed. The fallout began almost immediately, unfolding in real time even as Victoria's car pulled away from the Ashford estate. Margaret, still visibly stunned by the loss of a gift she had never even known was being offered, turned on her son with a fury that several guests later described as unlike anything they'd previously witnessed from the normally composed, restrained woman. "Do you understand what you just cost this family?" she demanded, her voice carrying across the immediate vicinity of the head table. "Do you have any idea what she was trying to do for us? And you humiliated her in front of everyone before she even had the chance to share it?" Charlotte, whose own earlier participation in mocking Victoria's mannerisms suddenly carried a very different weight given what had just been revealed, found herself the target of pointed questions from several guests and family members, questions she struggled to answer given her own complicity in the evening's earlier dynamics. She turned defensively toward her brother. "You're the one who called her an embarrassment in front of the entire wedding. This isn't on me." The argument that followed spread quickly through the extended family. Relatives who had witnessed both the original humiliation and its devastating financial consequence taking sides, some defending Andrew's frustration as understandable given years of what he characterized, defensively as Victoria's inability to fully integrate into the family's social world, others openly condemning his behavior as cruel and entirely unjustified, regardless of whatever minor social frictions might have accumulated over the years. Andrew himself, apparently only now beginning to grasp the full magnitude of what his outburst had cost, attempted repeatedly throughout the remainder of the evening to reach Victoria by phone, his messages growing increasingly desperate as the night wore on, oscillating between angry justification and genuine, if apparently too late, apology. Victoria, driving home alone through the quiet late evening streets, found herself feeling something unexpected amid the emotional weight of everything that had just happened. Not devastation, though there was certainly grief mixed into the moment, but a kind of clear, settled relief. The particular relief of finally decisively naming a pattern she had spent years trying to accommodate rather than confront. In the days that followed, as Victoria began the difficult process of fully processing everything that had unfolded at the wedding, she uncovered additional layers of betrayal that added considerable weight to her growing certainty about the direction her life needed to take. Reviewing financial records with her own trusted advisor, she discovered that Andrew had been quietly struggling with significant financial difficulties for well over a year. investments that had underperformed considerably, business ventures he'd pursued independently that had failed to generate the returns he'd anticipated, debts he had never once mentioned to Victoria despite the substantial financial resources she had always assumed their marriage was built upon. More troubling still, her advisor uncovered evidence suggesting that Andrew had, at some point in recent months, become aware of the broader outlines of Victoria's planned gift to his mother, likely through some indiscretion on the part of someone tangentially connected to the transaction, and had apparently begun quietly counting on the eventual benefit he assumed would flow in some indirect way from his mother's restored estate, perhaps assuming access to the property himself, perhaps simply factoring the symbolic value of the gift into his own sense of financial security regarding his family's overall wealth and standing. This discovery reframed in Victoria's mind much of the tension that had built in the weeks leading up to the wedding. Andrew's increasing criticism, his mounting preoccupation with image and social performance, his outburst at the reception itself began to look, in retrospect, less like isolated incidents of poor judgment and more like symptoms of a man under considerable financial and psychological strain, a man who had perhaps convinced himself, on some level, that Victoria's wealth and generosity constituted an entitlement he was owed by virtue of marriage, rather than something requiring genuine respect and gratitude. He never actually valued what I brought to this marriage beyond what he assumed he was entitled to extract from it, Victoria told her financial advisor during one of their subsequent meetings, the realization settling into something firmer and more decisive with each additional piece of evidence she uncovered. The insults weren't really about my background or my manners. They were about frustration that I hadn't simply handed over everything he assumed marrying me would eventually provide. Victoria met with her attorney formally the following week, reviewing her complete financial holdings, the various business interests and personal assets she had built and maintained largely independent of her marriage to Andrew. She initiated divorce proceedings shortly thereafter, working methodically and without excessive emotional drama through the necessary legal processes, removing Andrew from various shared financial privileges and access points that had, throughout their marriage, allowed him considerably more visibility into and influence over Victoria's financial affairs than she now believed had ever been warranted. The consequences for Andrew in the months following the wedding proved considerably more severe than he had likely anticipated in the immediate aftermath of his outburst. Word of the incident spread quickly through the social circles the Collins family had always been so careful to cultivate and protect. The story of a husband publicly humiliating his wife only to have her withdraw an $8.8 million gift in devastating public response becoming something of a notorious local legend within the community's wealthy social networks. Andrew's own business relationships, already strained by his undisclosed financial difficulties, suffered further as word of his public behavior circulated among colleagues and associates, who found the entire episode simply too dramatic and too revealing of his underlying character to overlook. Margaret, for her part, spent considerable time in the aftermath of the wedding, coming to terms with the reality that Victoria, whom she had never quite managed to fully embrace despite years of proximity, had in fact been the single most genuinely generous person within the entire Collins family circle. The realization arrived with considerable, painful clarity once Margaret understood the full scope of what had been offered and then withdrawn, a recognition that forced her to reckon, for the first time in years, with her own passive complicity in the family dynamics that had ultimately driven Victoria to make the decision she had. Charlotte, whose wedding day had become permanently associated in the family's collective memory with this devastating incident rather than with her own celebration, expressed genuine regret in the weeks that followed for her own participation in mocking Victoria in the days leading up to the event, reaching out on several occasions with what appeared to be sincere, if somewhat late, attempts at reconciliation. The Collins family, more broadly, faced tangible financial difficulties in the months following the incident, difficulties that extended beyond the simple loss of the estate gift itself. Andrew's own struggling finances, once fully revealed through the divorce proceedings, created considerable additional strain on family resources that had already been operating with less cushion than the family's outward appearance of wealth had suggested. Several planned family investments and expenditures had to be scaled back or abandoned entirely as the full scope of the financial pressures became clear. Victoria, meanwhile, redirected the resources she had originally intended for the estate purchase towards something she found considerably more meaningful given everything that had transpired. Working with her financial advisor and a team of consultants specializing in charitable giving, she established a foundation dedicated to supporting first-generation college students and small business development within underserved communities, structuring the organization to provide scholarships, mentorship programs, and startup funding for entrepreneurs who, like Victoria herself in her early career, lacked the kind of established family wealth and connections that had smoothed the path for so many of the guests who had witnessed her humiliation at that wedding. I realized that meaningful generosity belongs where it's genuinely appreciated, Victoria explained to a local business journal that covered the foundation's launch several months later, an interview that carefully avoided direct discussion of the wedding incident itself, but that clearly, to anyone familiar with the broader story, reflected the personal journey that had led her toward this particular philanthropic direction. I spent years trying to earn acceptance from people who had already decided, long before I ever offered them anything, that I wasn't truly one of them. I'd rather invest that same generosity in people who are genuinely building something, who will actually value the support rather than simply expecting it as an entitlement. The foundation grew steadily over its first year, eventually supporting dozens of scholarship recipients and several promising small business ventures, providing Victoria with a genuine, meaningful sense of purpose that stood in sharp, welcome contrast to the years she had spent trying to navigate the Collins family's complicated, often cruel social dynamics. 1 year after the wedding, Victoria's original technology consulting business continued its steady growth, expanding into new markets and hiring additional staff as her reputation within the industry, already strong before the incident, grew further still, buoyed in part by the widespread public admiration for the composure and dignity she had displayed during a genuinely devastating public humiliation. She found, in the months following her divorce from Andrew, a kind of peace and independence she hadn't fully experienced during the later years of her marriage, when she had spent so much emotional energy managing Andrew's moods, anticipating his criticisms, calculating how to present herself in ways that might finally earn the acceptance that, she now understood clearly, had never actually been available to her regardless of her efforts. Andrew, by contrast, struggled considerably in the year following the divorce, his financial difficulties compounding as he navigated the settlement process without the resources he had, apparently long assumed would remain available to him through his marriage. His social standing within the community's wealthy circles never fully recovered from the incident, the story of his public cruelty and its devastating financial consequence remaining. For years afterward, a cautionary tale whispered among those who had witnessed it directly or heard the details secondhand. Margaret reached out to Victoria roughly 8 months after the wedding, requesting a private meeting that Victoria, after careful consideration, agreed to attend. Their conversation, conducted over coffee at a quiet cafe far removed from the Collins family's usual social circles, carried a raw honesty that had rarely characterized their interactions throughout Victoria's marriage to Andrew. "I should have said something at the wedding," Margaret told her, her voice carrying genuine, evident regret. "I've thought about that moment countless times since. I watched my son humiliate you, and I said nothing, the same way I've said nothing for years whenever I noticed him treating you with less respect than you deserved. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere in your marriage. But the truth is, I think I was simply afraid of confronting Andrew directly, the same way I've been afraid of confronting difficult truths within this family for most of my adult life." Victoria listened carefully, weighing the sincerity of Margaret's words against years of accumulated experience with a family that had rarely offered genuine accountability for its behavior. "I appreciate you saying that," she told Margaret eventually, "and I understand in some ways why you stayed silent for so long. But I need you to understand something too. The gift was never really about the property itself, or even about you specifically, though I did genuinely want you to have something you dreamed about for years. It was about the kind of respect and consideration I always hoped this family might eventually extend toward me. That never happened, regardless of what I offered." "I know," Margaret said quietly. "And I'm sorry, genuinely, for the part I played in that. I don't expect things to simply go back to how they were. I don't think they should. But I wanted you to know that I understand now how much you actually gave this family over the years, and how little we gave back in return." Victoria accepted Margaret's apology that afternoon, appreciating the honesty behind it even as she maintained clear, firm boundaries about what kind of ongoing relationship, if any, felt appropriate given everything that had happened. She agreed to occasional, limited contact with Margaret going forward. A relationship built now on considerably more honest terms than the complicated, largely one-sided dynamic that had characterized their years as mother and daughter-in-law. Reflecting on everything that had unfolded over that difficult, transformative year, Victoria found herself returning repeatedly to a set of hard-won understandings about respect, generosity, and self-worth that she recognized would shape the remainder of her life in ways far more significant than any single financial transaction, however substantial. Respect, she had come to understand with complete clarity, was worth infinitely more than any expensive gift, regardless of how meaningful the intention behind that gift might genuinely be. No amount of generosity, she now understood, could fundamentally repair a relationship built on a foundation of humiliation and entitlement. Wealth, she had learned firsthand, simply couldn't purchase the kind of genuine respect that needed to exist independently, prior to and separate from whatever material gestures might accompany it. She understood, too, with a clarity that had taken years of accumulated experience to fully crystallize, that genuine generosity should never be mistaken for weakness, and that people who did mistake it for exactly that were, in the process, revealing something essential about their own character rather than about the actual worth of whatever generosity they'd been offered. The right people, she had come to believe, valued you fully and genuinely before they ever knew what you might be capable of giving them. The alternative, a relationship built on the calculated anticipation of eventual material benefit, could never provide the kind of genuine partnership and respect that a healthy relationship actually required. And she understood, perhaps most importantly of all, that walking away with her own dignity fully intact, however painful and disruptive that departure had felt in the immediate aftermath of that devastating wedding reception, had ultimately been the greatest gift she could have possibly given herself. Greater in its own way than the $8.8 million estate she had once hoped might finally earn her a place within a family that had, in the end, never genuinely intended to offer her one. Sitting in her own home, months after the divorce had finalized, surrounded by the foundation's growing collection of scholarship applications and business proposals from ambitious young entrepreneurs building something meaningful from very little, exactly as she herself once had, Victoria felt for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, a settled, genuine peace with the direction her life had ultimately taken. The wedding reception that had once represented, in her original planning, an evening of quiet, generous surprise had instead become the pivotal turning point that finally freed her from years of trying to earn acceptance that had never actually been available to her, redirecting instead toward a life built on her own values, her own genuine relationships, and a form of generosity that finally, meaningfully, found its way toward people capable of genuinely appreciating it. She thought often during those quieter months about the particular irony embedded in everything that had happened, that the very gesture she had planned as an act of pure generosity, offered without any expectation of reciprocity or recognition, had ultimately become the mechanism through which she finally recognized just how little genuine reciprocity had ever existed within her marriage. She had spent years operating under the quiet, largely unexamined assumption that her own consistent generosity, patience, and accommodation would eventually be met with equivalent warmth and respect. The wedding reception had simply made undeniable what had, in truth, been building for years beneath the surface of a marriage that looked, from the outside, considerably more successful than it had ever actually felt from within. She found herself reflecting, too, on the particular courage it had taken to withdraw the gift in that moment, rather than simply absorbing the humiliation as she had absorbed so many similar moments throughout her marriage. It would have been easier, in some ways, to simply proceed with the original plan, to reveal the gift as intended despite Andrew's outburst, to continue extending generosity even in the face of public cruelty, the way she had for years. But something in that specific moment, standing on the terrace in the cool evening air, had finally crystallized a truth she'd been circling for a very long time. That continued generosity toward people who had shown no genuine capacity for reciprocal respect wasn't kindness at all, but rather a slow, continuous erosion of her own sense of worth, dressed up in the more comfortable language of patience and family loyalty. The foundation, as it grew, became for Victoria something considerably more meaningful than simply a philanthropic project undertaken in the aftermath of a difficult divorce. It became, over time, a genuine expression of the values she had always held, but had, for years, poured disproportionately into a marriage and family that had never fully reciprocated them. She found herself, in board meetings and scholarship review sessions, experiencing a version of generosity that felt entirely different from what she had extended toward the Collins family. warmer, more immediate, met consistently with genuine gratitude from young people who understood exactly what kind of difference meaningful support could make in a life just beginning to build itself. She met, through the Foundation's early cohort of scholarship recipients, a young woman named Priya Anand, a first-generation college student pursuing a degree in mechanical engineering, whose grandmother had recently immigrated to build a small tailoring business from nothing, much the way Victoria's own parents had once built their manufacturing company decades earlier. Watching Priya's genuine, unguarded gratitude during their first meeting, watching the young woman's eyes fill with tears as she described what the scholarship would mean for her family, Victoria felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't fully experienced in years of trying to earn acceptance from people who had never intended to offer it freely. "This is what generosity is supposed to feel like," she told her financial advisor after that meeting, a realization that continued to deepen with each subsequent scholarship recipient and small business owner she encountered through the Foundation's growing work. Not something extended in the hope of eventually earning something back. Just support, given because it matters, met with genuine appreciation rather than quiet entitlement. Andrew, in the meantime, continued struggling considerably in the aftermath of the divorce, his financial difficulties compounding as the settlement process moved forward without the resources he had apparently long assumed would remain available to him. He reached out to Victoria on several occasions during that first year, his messages ranging from genuine, if belated, attempts at apology to more transparent efforts to renegotiate elements of the settlement in his favor, framing each request in the language of reconciliation while consistently, underneath the surface, seeking some form of continued financial benefit from a marriage that had already ended. Victoria responded to these overtures with the same calm, measured composure she had displayed throughout the entire ordeal, declining any renegotiation of terms her attorney had already carefully and fairly established, while occasionally, when Andrew's messages carried what seemed like genuine reflection, rather than continued entitlement, offering brief, honest responses acknowledging the reality of what had happened between them without reopening any door toward reconciliation. "I don't think you ever fully understood what respect actually requires," she wrote to him once, in response to a particularly lengthy message in which Andrew had attempted, at considerable length, to explain the financial pressures that had contributed to his outburst at the wedding. "I understand you were under considerable stress, but stress doesn't excuse cruelty, and it certainly doesn't excuse the years of smaller moments that led up to that evening. I hope you find your way toward genuine accountability eventually, for your own sake as much as anyone else's, but I'm not the person who can offer you that path forward anymore." Charlotte's own attempts at reconciliation, by contrast, seemed to carry a more genuine quality over time, her initial defensive posture in the immediate aftermath of the wedding gradually giving way, over the following months, to what appeared to be authentic reflection on her own participation in the family's broader pattern of casual cruelty toward Victoria. She reached out periodically, never pushing for more contact than Victoria seemed comfortable offering, gradually rebuilding a considerably more honest, if inevitably more distant, relationship than the one that had existed before the wedding. "I keep thinking about all the small comments I made over the years, thinking they were harmless," Charlotte admitted during one of their occasional conversations, roughly a year after the wedding. "I told myself I was just teasing, the way siblings and family members sometimes do. But watching what actually happened, understanding what you were planning to give our family right as we were all mocking you for not fitting in well enough, I don't think I can pretend anymore that any of it was harmless." Victoria appreciated Charlotte's honesty, even as she remained careful about how much emotional energy she was willing to reinvest in relationships that had caused her genuine, sustained harm over the years. She had learned, through the entire ordeal, to distinguish more clearly between people capable of authentic accountability and those who simply wanted the discomfort of consequence to pass as quickly and painlessly as possible. Margaret's own transformation, in the months and years following their initial post-divorce conversation, proved gradual but genuinely sustained. She began quietly, supporting the Foundation's work in small but meaningful ways, occasionally connecting Victoria with contacts who might benefit the organization's mission, never seeking public credit or acknowledgement for these contributions. A shift in behavior that Victoria recognized, cautiously, as considerably more aligned with genuine change than anything she had witnessed from Margaret during the years of her marriage to Andrew. 2 years after the wedding, Victoria found herself reflecting on the entire arc of the experience during a quiet evening at home, the Foundation now firmly established and thriving, her own business continuing its steady growth, Her personal life settled into a rhythm of genuine peace that felt, in many ways, unrecognizable compared to the anxious, carefully managed existence she had maintained throughout her marriage to Andrew. She had begun cautiously dating again during that second year, though she approached the prospect with a considerably more discerning eye than she had brought to her relationship with Andrew, watching carefully for the early warning signs she had once dismissed as minor friction rather than genuine indicators of deeper incompatibility. She found herself drawn, when she did eventually begin a new relationship, to a partner who valued her achievements and generosity not as resources to be quietly counted upon, but as genuine expressions of her character worth admiring and, crucially, reciprocating in kind. Reflecting on everything that had unfolded over that difficult, transformative period, Victoria understood, with a clarity that felt permanently settled rather than merely temporary, that the wedding reception which had once represented, in her original planning, an evening of quiet, generous surprise had instead become the pivotal turning point that finally freed her from years of trying to earn acceptance that had never actually been available to her, redirecting her instead toward a life built on her own values, her own genuine relationships, and a form of generosity that finally, meaningfully, found its way toward people capable of genuinely appreciating it.